So let's see. Let's talk a little bit about eternal law. And I don't know if you watched it, but there was a debate, I believe, between Kwaku El and Vocab Malone. And we had him on our program to talk about the debate. And they kind of debated this idea of eternal law. So one of the traditional LDS views is that there is eternal law that pre-exists God. So quoting Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, 2021, it says, quote, "There is a law irrevocably decreed in heaven before the foundations of this world, upon which all blessings are predicated. And when we obtain any blessing from God, it is by obedience to that law upon which it is predicated," end quote. So do you believe, as many traditional LDS believe, or according to traditional LDS doctrine, that God achieved immortality and eternal life or exaltation through obedience to these eternal laws, or has he eternally been God?
Well, let's take that verse you were talking about there. I don't think that's talking about what philosophers are talking about, like moral law and those types of things. It seems that they're talking more about how God gives punishment or reward for certain things. There's certain rules he sets up, certain things he asks us to do, and those types of things. Those wouldn't be eternal because, well, we haven't existed on the earth eternally. And also Joseph Smith pointed out when he was, when God was producing intelligences, he said God ordained laws for them to progress. So if God ordained laws, that means the law didn't exist already. So I think law is something law comes from a lawgiver. So it's not independent of one. So I don't think God followed perhaps the identical laws that we would have to progress to be what God is. It seems that there's a multitude of ways for that to happen.
Okay, that was going to be my question. Yeah.
So as far as do I believe God came to be God and there was a time when God wasn't God? Yes. How did God follow the same path exactly that humans on earth have to do? That I don't know. I'm inclined to think not. It seems there are just different ways of getting at that.
Yeah, it does seem, even in the King Follett discourse, Joseph Smith kind of he does make statements that seem very certain at times, and then some that seem very vague. Like at one point, he says, "You have got to learn how to become gods as all gods before you." Yes. So it seems like, upon that reading, it seems like what he's saying is that that Elohim and all the previous gods did follow that same law. But as you said, it's not.
Well, certainly there's similar patterns of getting a body, gaining experiences, learning things, and also the time of learning not just being upon the earth. It seems Joseph Smith also talked about there's a lot to learn after you die, so you're not going to learn it all here, which gives me a little comfort. There's so much to learn here, and if there's this much to know, I feel like we maybe learned this much while we're here on earth. So
yeah, I definitely agree with that. There's going to be a lot more to learn when we pass on.
Yeah, so just kind of follow up on that, because I've seen, there are certain Latter-day Saint thinkers that read Alma 42 verses 24 and 25 to kind of imply the existence of at least two laws kind of outside of God's own nature.
You're talking about where he talks to his son about if God did this, he would cease to be God.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So it says, "For behold, justice exerciseth all his demands, and also mercy claimeth all which is her own, and thus none but the truly penitent are saved. What do you suppose, that mercy can rob justice? I say unto you, nay, not one whit. If so, God would cease to be God." And so some Latter-day Saint thinkers have taken particularly the kind of the anthropomorphic language and pronouns that are used for mercy and justice there, and also the idea that God could
making them persons. It would seem almost.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, and also to suggest that it's not just rhetoric. That if God were to go against those laws, then he would cease to be God. What's your view on that line of thinking?
I think what Alma's talking about there is that once God has given kind of a promise, he can't go back on the promise or he would cease to be God. That would be justice and mercy, the things he's promised, and that there's a way, and that it almost seems that justice and mercy are at odds. And I think what Alma's trying to convey is there is a way that God can make them work together where they seem like they can be exclusive at times. But I don't think that justice and mercy are things in and of themselves. I think that justice and mercy are traits of a person.
Yep, I would agree with that. I think that they're attributes.
So there are people who think that justice, mercy, truth, beauty are things in themselves. This is what Plato and Platonists think, that they're these abstract objects that exist. I don't think that's correct.
Okay.
I certainly, if they are, I don't think they're people, which is, I think that's just a moving way of Alma giving his telling the story.
Yeah,
but I don't think they're the things, and I don't think I certainly don't think they're external to God. They're part of God's nature.
Okay. Yep. I think we would agree on that. Matthew, would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'd agree with that.
All right. Let's see. Kind of moving on to the next question. And I think that actually touches on the next question. So the next question was kind of getting to that point. Like, what do you think of the Christian view that the moral laws are unchanging and reflective of God's perfect nature? Can God's moral laws be changed over time or due to circumstance? What do you think?
Well, there's a lot of different ways that Christians throughout the history of Christianity and in the present think of that. Some people think of moral law as being, part of God's nature. This is kind of how William Lane Craig talks about it, that morality is part of God's perfection and they exist as part of him. So they're real things, but they're part of a person rather than abstractly. Some people, like Richard Swinburne, think that morality are necessary truths that exist independent of God. So God obeys them rather than him making them per se. But it would seem to me that so wait, now what was the full question again? Sorry, I was just throwing some views out there, just throwing that there wasn't just one Christian view of that. So
yeah. So I think you've kind of laid out that you view God's laws as flowing from his perfect nature. Do I think Latter-day Saints believe that God's subject to moral laws? Yeah, that and do you believe that God's moral laws can be changed over time or due to circumstance?
Well, I think that law can be changed. That again, as it comes from a lawgiver. So yes, I do think moral law can be changed. Some are less susceptible to change, I would think. But yes, they can be changed. I don't think they're written in stone. I'm not even sure. I think when we use the term law, what we want to say is that these things are exactly what they are. They're always the same. They never change. I don't think that's exactly how morality works. I think morality evolves and it's situational. This is something that is kind of shown early in the Book of Mormon, where Nephi is asked to kill Laban, and Nephi says, "No, you're not supposed to kill anyone." And then the Spirit says, "Look, better to kill this guy, and everybody's good, and everyone's knows about the gospel than him just to live." So, kind of that would be more of my view. It's similar to what you'll find in virtue ethics. So where what it means to be a moral person is to have certain traits that you're patient, kind, just, those types of things. But those don't necessitate doing one action in every situation. There's a variety of things you can do. So I wouldn't be a moral absolutist.
So would you say that that's why there's a continuing need in the mind of Latter-day Saints, or at least in your mind, for prophets and apostles today, because if moral laws or morality can change, then we need someone to, kind of help us to know what God wants us to obey, or how we should be moral.
Well, that's part of it. And then also just the moral questions are very different today. There wasn't, thousands of years ago, there wasn't pornography. There wasn't the questions of how we view marriage and other types of things were very different back then. So we need someone to communicate with us what we should do at certain times. So yeah, I think that's part of it.
Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit different because we would say, we would agree that definitely circumstances have changed. It's changed even in the last 100 years. Society's changed, and so. But sorry, go ahead.
We can kind of see that with kind of moving from the Law of Moses to the New Testament. I don't think Christians would stone adulteresses or adulterers where they would have in the Old Testament, kind of a thing. So, or at least that was the moral code then. So I think that God, in dealing with different people in different circumstances, it's not going to look exactly the same.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. The Reformed, the way that they kind of addressed that whole thing with, why was it okay to stone in the Old Testament, not in the New, is they saw they called it the threefold distinction. I'm sure you probably run into that at some point. It's this idea that the law was separated, or it's not hard separations, but it's kind of, you can kind of divide the code into civil or judicial law, ethical or moral law, and then you also have ceremonial law. And so the ceremonial law was finished in Christ.
And the Old Testament is also a theocracy, so it's a little different.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So with the end of, national Israel, the civil and judicial codes were kind of finished. So basically what we're left with is the moral law, which is, basically the 10 Commandments. So that's kind of how the Reformed would address that. But like you said, you would believe that it's the moral. So the Reformed saw that the moral law is something that was constant, although it could, apply differently based on circumstances. But the moral law was unchanging because God's unchanging, and it reflects his holy nature. But you would say that God can change the law over time. Just reiterating what you said. Is that correct?
Right. And Latter-day Saints couldn't base the moral code on God's unchanging nature because they believe God changes. So
right. So it's kind of, it's just trying to make the connection maybe for our listeners who, to see where these differences in theology kind of flow into our beliefs and our lives.
I would say among Latter-day Saints, morality is going to be more practical than metaphysical. That means it's not going to be written in facts about how the world is. It's more about how to kind of get along as social creatures. And there are different kind of ways you can do that with different eras of people. So,
it's
great.
Interesting. Why do you think there is that distinction within Latter-day Saint thought and theology where it's more practical?
Well, I think it goes back to Latter-day Saints being materialists, and it's very difficult to have moral absolutes within a materialist framework. That's why most moral realists are not naturalists or materialists. They think that there's something else in addition to the physical world. It's very hard to see, get right and wrong out of physics or neuroscience or other things. Now, there are some people who think you can. They're called moral naturalists that think that what's right to do can be, in some sense, discoverable through the scientific means, but I don't think that is the case. I think that morality has to do what you ought to do or how you should behave. And science is dealing with facts only. So there's that fact value distinction there. Mm-hmm. So that's why I would say Latter-day Saints are moved more towards a practical version of morality than an absolute version that I think is more open to traditional Christians, I'll say.
Yeah, great. Thanks for explaining that. So,
and I guess I would also say that since a lot of people think that God is still learning things, So it would be kind of hard to make something absolute if the being that you worship is still learning it. So now, of course, there's different variations on that. Some people, like Blake Ostler, think that God knows most everything, kind of like that. He's not learning eternal laws of the universe or things like that, or the moral laws, if those exist. People like B.H. Roberts would think that God is forever learning and there's always more to learn. Whereas I think God knows everything past, present, and future, and there's nothing else for him to learn. So he's not learning morality. He's just kind of giving us different systems so we can coexist as a species.
Yeah, and I think as a Latter-day Saint, I would have agreed with your view. I think what I would have explained is that, at least the way I was taught and the way I believed, is that we spent, an eternity past before we came to earth with God. And so he knows us so well, or so intimately, by spending all that time with us and, being God, the creator, that he knows exactly everything that will come to pass, based on that. Is that how you would kind of explain your self-determinism, or?
No, the view that you just elucidated, that's similar to James E. Talmage's view when he talks about God watching you for so long, and then you come to earth, but he knew you for so long, he knows what you're going to do. But considering that you weren't fully embodied and you are fully embodied, your circumstances are quite different. And also, I believe you believe in, are you a libertarian about free will? I can't remember.
I'm a compatibilist.
Okay. Most Latter-day Saints are libertarians, so that would mean libertarianism would seem to rule out that God could know what free choice you would make, because it wouldn't seem that you would be free to make that choice if God already knows. The choice has kind of been made. So no, I mean, my view is that since the past, present, and future all exist, that God can know. Since he knows the past, he can, by extension, know the present and future, because it's only going to come out one way, which is why God is always so confident about how things will turn out.
Okay.
He's not worried about there being chinks in the armor. What move will someone do? He already knows what he's going to do. That's why he's not worried about it. It must be very freeing to do that.
Yeah, I love that. We talked a little bit about Calvin. So is it all right if I throw a question at you, not on the list? So
Absolutely.
How would you differentiate your view of how God knows everything past, present, and future versus, the Calvinist view that there's an eternal decree, of all things that would come to pass? Would you see much of a difference there practically?
Well, Calvin, it would seem that God is causally responsible for everything that happens. Is that correct? I know neither of you are Calvinists, but I think that's the view. Yes,
I am, but yeah.
Right. Okay. I don't think Latter-day Saints think that God is causally responsible. God can know the causes that lead up to what happens, but God himself doesn't cause everything. For example, God is a caused being, so he couldn't be the cause of everything. So that would be a difference, where in Calvin's view, God causes everything to be the way it is. So that's why he knows what he knows. That would also be very similar to Aquinas' view. They're different in certain respects, but God would be the causal agent there. Having said that, I know that many of my Latter-day Saint friends are not fans of John Calvin, and that's their loss. I think he was a wonderful man, great thinker. I fully agree with him on the atonement. However, I'm a penal substitution guy. And ironically, lots of Latter-day Saints are also penal substitution people, but they don't seem to recognize that that's a very Calvinist view. So it's always a funny intersection. They hate Calvin, but think he's right about the atonement without knowing it. So now that's not all Latter-day Saints. There are others who are not penal substitution people, but the common Latter-day Saint accepts penal substitution.
The one big difference, I would think, and there is still debate about what Calvin actually believed in terms of the extent of the atonement, whether it was limited, unlimited. There seemed to be some quotes from Calvin that seemed to demonstrate he thought in a limited atonement, some that seemed to, that he believed that Christ died for all. So from the modern Calvinist view, in limited atonement or particular redemption, or whatever you want to call it, that's definitely a departure from what LDS view of the atonement, since you believe it's a universal, right, an unlimited atonement.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for answering those questions. Appreciate it.
No problem.
So let's go on to the Trinity, and we talked a little bit about how when you were younger, you said it was difficult to understand, a spiritual, non-material God. But let's focus more about just the 3 in 1 of the Trinity. So when Christians describe the Trinity, there's a distinction that's always made between essence or being, or ousia in Greek, and persons or hypostasis, such that God can be 1 in being and 3 in persons, without being contradictory. So do you believe this is a valid categorization, a valid distinction, or why or why not?
But if I understand it correctly, what you're saying the Trinity is that there's that these 3 persons, or we'll say 3 centers of self-consciousness, are made of the same substance, and that's what makes them one. But they're 3 centers of self-consciousness, so the Father can say, I am the Father, the Son can say, I am the Son, the Holy Ghost can say, I am the Holy Ghost. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, I accept that that's the view. And I don't think there's anything contradictory in it.
Yeah, that's one thing that I really struggled with, as Latter-day Saint, because it just didn't make sense to me. But it really requires just understanding, okay, God's not like me. When we think of person, even I really struggle even just explaining the Trinity, because the word person has a lot of baggage to it. When we say person, we think of, human being, separate from each other. Maybe you can help me out. Do you, like you said, center of consciousness or center of will? Would you say that that's maybe a more appropriate view from what you understand of the Trinity?
I find it also hard to understand exactly what a person is. That's one of my interests in philosophy, is personal identity. And but yeah, I guess I understand overall the idea that if you think of consciousness as awareness and having will in the world and having some sort of causal influence, I can see how there could be these things. For me, the problem of the Trinity is not the 3 persons; it's the immaterialism. That's the problem.
Okay. Yeah, that's one thing that I noticed a lot of these things struggle with. And I mean, I struggle with it too, because they ask, well, what is spirit? And to be honest, there's a whole section of theology. I think it's apophatic theology. It's the idea that you tells
you what God is and not what God is.
Right, precisely. Yeah, there's so much, God is so different from us and transcendent, that many times when we talk about how God being infinite, well, that's saying that he's not finite. Or, immutable means he's not mutable. He's not, changeable. So a lot of times that's the best we can do, So when the Latter-day Saint asks me what spirit is, I have to say, I don't know, I can't really describe it.
There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's
again, I don't think the problem of the Trinity is logical incoherence or even understanding. I think it's just a different ontological question of, do you think a person can exist immaterially, or is being a material being essential to being a person? So.
And it is
because I think, and John Mackey talks about this in his book, The Miracle of Theism. He says, well, all the persons that we're acquainted with are material, but we can certainly think of a person without a body and doing certain things. So there's no logical contradiction, or we wouldn't be able to conceive of it. So.
And a lot of times, like I've started studying Aquinas, his first part of his Summa Theologiae, and he uses a lot of analogies to describe God, to describe the procession in God, that the Son is begotten of the Father, the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. But he admits that when we talk about the Son being begotten, we don't really know what that means. It's analogical. There's some kind of connection between Father and Son that's analogous to, a human Father and a human Son, but it's not exact, because God is not human in the traditional classical theist sense. So that's sometimes the best we can do. And he has to, I think that's what we have to do as believers, as to some extent. And I think even a lot of Latter-day Saints I'll talk to will admit this as well, is that to some extent we can't fully comprehend God.
Right, we can't. There are lots of things we can't fully comprehend. We can't fully comprehend what time is. We can't fully understand what space and matter are. We can't fully understand our introspective awareness. There are lots of things we can't fully understand. That doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that we're epistemologically limited, and we have to acknowledge there's a lot we don't know, a lot we don't understand. However, I think where this is a problem is therefore people think that's gives them license to just think whatever they want about something without having to explain it. That I think is unwarranted. But there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know how it happens. I don't think there's a contradiction, and I think there's reason to believe it's the case. So that's fine. For example, if you believe that God, as I believe both of you do, is the efficient cause of space and time, then God couldn't be a spatio-temporal being, so he'd have to be an immaterial being. So yes, we can understand why you would believe that. And it's an interesting and valid reason, but you would agree that you don't exactly know how God does that. Like how is God, it's kind of like the question, how is God omnipotent? We don't know how he is, we know that he is, kind of a thing, and we'll work from there.
Right, yeah, lots of great points.
Yeah, and so the question of, how could a person exist immaterially that you referenced before, that doesn't that go kind of directly to the hard problem of consciousness, where we haven't really been able to explain how consciousness arises from the mind, right? From the physical.
The hard problem with consciousness is how does matter, space, things that don't seem to have any introspective awareness or causality or things like that, how is it that we, being made up of those things, do seem to have this phenomenal quality to us that we seem to be conscious, even though we assume most things like rocks aren't conscious, even though we're made of the same types of things, quarks, leptons, bosons, etc. So for some people, that leads them to say maybe that's because there's another substance that's part of our being that isn't part of the other thing. So these would be the substance dualists. Most Christians are substance dualists. Certainly among Protestants, they take after Descartes' view of that. Aquinas is a hyomorphist, which is a bit different, which is that, so his view is more materialist than, say, Descartes is. So there's different ways of looking at that. My own view is that phenomenal consciousness doesn't exist, so there is no hard problem. I'm an illusionist about consciousness. I don't think consciousness exists.
Which goes back to your question when you were 9 years old.
Oh, that's a different question of the problem of perception in other minds. You can be an illusionist and still think those are open questions.
Okay.
So yes.
So Matthew, did you have a follow-up there?
Yeah, just a quick one. So you would say that consciousness is, so the fact that we are conscious is because we are, we're spirit beings that were inhabiting our physical bodies, that like our consciousness is related to the physicality of our spirit, our being spirit beings by nature.
I don't think consciousness exists. There is no consciousness.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm a low brainer trying to reach up to your level. So I'm trying to
let me walk that back a little bit. So there's this question in philosophy of mind. This question is called phenomenal consciousness or qualia. So let's use an example. Do both of you like burgers?
For sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Paul's from Kentucky. He loves burgers.
Okay. Well, fine. Let's say we're both at Five Guys, which is one of my favorite burger joints, and we're each having a burger there. So there's something now. You can know everything that the burger's made of and things like that, but you can't. But when Paul takes a bite out of his burger, you can, by analogy, say, I think it tastes something like what I'm tasting for Paul to taste the burger, but you don't know what it's like for Paul to taste it. And there's nothing that physical inspection could do that would tell you what it's like for him to have that. So that's called phenomenal consciousness. It's only accessible to you. It's perfectly private, and no physical inspection will tell you about that experience. You'll never fully understand it. It's only open to that person.
Right. So when I was younger, my sister, my older sister's favorite color was purple. And she asked me the question, how do you know when you see purple that it's the same as when I see it? Same kind of idea, right?
Yeah, right. That's very similar. I just use the food analogy because it's an easy one. So the physicalist who thinks that everything's physical will say, well, there's nothing beyond what physics and neuroscience say, so there isn't another thing. That's just an illusion if you think that. Now so they replace it with not the hard problem of consciousness, but the hard question of why is that question and that illusion so strong? And it's probably because we only have acquaintance with our own kind of body, but we're a different collection of atoms than another person is. So it's kind of hard for us to understand that it's exactly the same, but that's where materialism will lead you to kind of rejecting that view of consciousness. Now, lots of people are not happy with that view. Illusionism is definitely the minority view among philosophers of mind, but that's the view I hold. That's the view Dan Dennett, Keith Frankish, Andy Clark, Peter Carruthers. That's the view we hold. Most people will say that quality or phenomenal consciousness does exist, and it can be explained. How we'll explain it will vary, or maybe we might not, but they'll still believe that they have it. So, you guys all look confused.
Yeah, I understand when philosophers say, that there's an illusion of free will, right? I get that. I'm struggling to understand what you mean when you say that there's an illusion of consciousness.
Well, I certainly think that you're aware of things. So I'm aware that you're of you on the screen, you're aware of me on the screen, those types of things. What I'm talking about is this kind of, people think there's like an inner show of consciousness that you can only understand from the first person rather than the third person. So in other words, they're saying, even if you understood all the neurology, all the physiology of who I am as a person, you would still not understand what it's like to be me. All right, so that's what that person is saying. So that person says phenomenal consciousness is above those things. If you say all there is physical stuff, so there's nothing to you beyond your biophysical makeup, then you'll conclude no, that type of inner show doesn't exist. It's just an illusion. It appears one way, but it's not really that way. Now, some illusionists could say, well, is that the same for free will? And I don't think that's the case, because even though I think you're a fully physical organism, I know both of you disagree with that, as you're assumedly both dualists about the mind. You mean you believe that you have some type of immaterial soul. Would that be right?
Yes.
Okay. You would still have free will in the sense of you have enough control over what you do that as long as someone's not pointing a gun to your head or pushing you or making you do something, then you do it freely. So I don't think free will is an illusion. I do think certain aspects of consciousness are illusions. Does that make better sense?
So would that mean that, if I understand correctly, does that mean if you had a way of looking into the mind of someone, being able to examine their brain, hook up electrodes to it, whatever you needed to do to be able to get all of the information you needed from a material, perspective, then you could understand kind of their experience or what they're seeing or what they're feeling and experiencing? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So there's kind of an objectivity to experience that you can measure, sort of.
Right. Basically, my view is it's kind of like, we can fully understand what it's like to be a robot. I think humans are just moist robots. So humans are interesting, but they're not special in the sense that they can't be fully understood.
I was trying to remember. I don't think that's a bad thing. I remember, I mean, I've only taken undergraduate courses in psychology, but that's a big debate, is whether psychology is even a science, like whether it can be a science, whether you can predict, what people will do, or it can actually diagnose. And I think that's probably something that's still debated today related to what you're talking about, whether it's an actual science or a pseudoscience or something.
Yeah, they're different. I think most people would agree that you can certainly study humans. It's how much and how should you do it? Should you just observe behavior and stimulus outputs? That's what behaviorism is. Or should you say there's something more going on in the brain that's apart from just behavior? That would be cognitivism, which is the more dominant view of psychology now. Although behaviorism hasn't completely gone away, and it's making somewhat of a renaissance in other areas. It certainly maybe like the type that Skinner talks about, radical behaviorism, that's probably gone by the wayside. Behaviorism completely has not. So.
All right, so we're down to the last question. What are some of the other moral or philosophical questions about non-LDS Christianity beliefs that you believe are the most difficult for LDS to understand, or make it difficult for them to embrace or have effective dialogue with non-Latter-day Saint Christians?
The first would be kind of in the philosophy of language, that we use a lot of similar terms, and then we think we're talking about the same thing, but we aren't. And so that leads into the problem of equivocation. For example, lots of people will say, Latter-day Saints talking to other Christians will say, well, we're Christians too. Yes, that's true to an extent, but you are radically different. So, and sometimes Latter-day Saints don't fully understand how radically different their views are. Obviously, as we talked about the Trinity, I think one question for them is, how to view the Trinity. How are the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost one, and how can we be one with them? Those are still questions for Latter-day Saints. I think the question of just even doing theology is a big question for Latter-day Saints, since I think within the Christian tradition, it seems that there's a very strong commitment to theology can be done, and it can be a successful science, as Aquinas and Calvin and Luther and others have shown, whereas a lot of everyday Latter-day Saints are more skeptical of that. It's not that. I think within traditional Christian circles, it's more of a lack of awareness of all the theology that's been done, more than the skepticism towards it. But within the Latter-day Saint community, it's more of a skepticism towards theology itself. So those are some of the questions I think that they're still wrestling with. Also, the question of kind of universalism versus non-universalism. I think you're seeing a lot more of a resurgence of certain Latter-day Saints being more open to universalism than they were in the past. So those are some kind of questions there, which is also, interestingly enough, in the Christian community, non-Latter-day Saint Christian community, people like David Bentley Hart have also been pushing universalism. So it's interesting because it's like the Book of Mormon is kind of both universalist and not universalist. So it's kind of like justice and mercy. How do the two things work together? Can they work together? Kind of the thing.
Yeah, that's one thing I struggled with too. Well, even when I was LDS, because there seem to be passages in the Book of Mormon that are very strongly suggesting that, this is the time to prepare to meet God. And, when you leave this life, the same Spirit will inhabit you in the next life, to eternal life and happiness, or eternal condemnation. And it seems like to me, when I would read the Book of Mormon, it put the fear of God into me, for lack of a better word. But then when you read the Doctrine and Covenants in Section 76, it's like, well, that's only temporary. Those who are murderers and, do all kinds of sins, they'll still achieve telestial glory. So that's kind of one thing I struggle with still when I talk to LDS is I don't know. I maybe there probably is a way to reconcile those things, but it just does seem like the Book of Mormon and D&C are kind of painting different pictures.
I'd also throw out Nehor, who was a universalist and also, but killed for killing the other person. But I'm thinking that preachers should be paid another thing. So that's another. I think the skepticism probably of universalism probably comes from the idea of, if universalism is true, then it makes no difference how I live my life here and now, because I'll be saved anyway, and we want to avoid that. I personally am a universalist. I believe everyone will eventually be saved. That doesn't mean I don't think that people won't go on for long, long periods of time, longer than I can conceive, without being saved. It doesn't mean people will just die and everyone gets the same outcome. I think what Amulek is saying is, look, it's true that you could be saved eventually, but don't think that just going to the next life is going to magically change who you are. There's still going to be reasons for you to not act even then, and that can go on forever. But ultimately, I think God will save everyone. So, but He won't force them to be saved. That will be a conscious choice.
I think there's a lot of people who would, outside the LDS Church, that would call themselves Christians, like Rob Bell. I know that he's a universalist that's kind of become more popular. I think that's kind of what his motto is that, eventually love will win in the end. That the God's love will draw everyone to Him. So is that kind of similar?
Yeah, but I do believe in hell in the sense of separation from God. So I do believe in hell. I don't believe hell is a place of torture, though. So I think that being separated from God causes its own anguish and anxiety, which is, I think, in part why there are lots of reasons why we humans are anxious and have anxiety. And I think one of the reasons is because we are separated from God during this lifetime. And so that's one cause. Now, that's not to say that just by believing in God or being a Christian, you'd stop being anxious. No, that there are lots of causes of anxiety and depression, and those need to be addressed through proper medical channels. I'm just saying that's an additional reason.
Yeah,
it can be its own form of torture. I think when I'm anxious and depressed, that's far worse, I think, than fire or brimstone. So,
yeah, that's great. I was going to ask a question, but it totally slipped my mind. So for LDS,
if it comes back, feel free to ask.
Yeah, it was something along the lines of, because we've been talking about philosophical ideas that are hard for LDS to embrace. And okay, so one thing that I think it's really hard for LDS to understand is grace, because many times when Christians, non-LDS Christians, we talk about grace and how it's a free gift of God. It's somehow something that, it doesn't make sense, because experientially we're so used to having to work for what we receive in some aspect. So why do you think that is that LDS struggle to understand the Christian view of grace, that it's a free gift given to, by God?
In part, it's because we are, in Americans, Latter-day, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was restored in America, and it has American origins and things like that. And Americans tend to think of you should get what you earn rather than something just being given to you. This is more popular among libertarians and conservatives, and by and large, Latter-day Saints traditionally are conservative and libertarian, although there are lots of very good Latter-day Saints who are social democrats or socialists or a large variety of views, and you can hold any of those views and be a Latter-day Saint. So that's not a problem. I think that's one. The other kind of has to do with what I talked about earlier. That is Latter-day Saints not doing a lot of theology. So they think grace means one thing when grace can mean a lot of things. And also Latter-day Saints tend to trivialize their own theology. So the plan of salvation, I think, is a plan of grace. In other words, it's given to you. You can choose to accept or not accept, the gift of life. The atonement is all about grace, God, Jesus giving his life for you and you choosing to accept, and that being a totally free gift. Immortality also comes through grace. So I think, ironically, while Latter-day Saints, and this was probably more a problem 40 or 50 years ago than it is now, it seems that the restored gospel is all about grace, and we just don't recognize that all the time. Hopefully it's being recognized that way more now. I don't see that as much of an issue as much now. It may have been maybe 10 years ago. When I first joined the church, I think it was more of a problem than it is now. Dieter F. Uchtdorf gave a talk about grace in General Conference a few years ago that summed it up pretty well.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about that in our conversation with Jackson as well, that because he's been a lifelong member, so we kind of see that also, this kind of shift in the LDS church. So I think it'll, and in my opinion, I think it's going to continue to shift, and I think that's probably a positive thing, because Paul in my experience. Sorry, go ahead.
You don't earn salvation, so it's a bit silly to even think of it that way.
Yeah, in my experience when I was LDS, there still was this culture of very high expectations, very high pressure environment, and it leads to a lot of people struggle with depression and things like that. And so I think overall that a better or more biblical understanding of grace would kind of alleviate that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's anything wrong with having high standards, but
sure,
we're all going to fall short.
Sure, Paul, did you have anything to add? I think those are most of the questions I wanted to ask.
No, I think we covered everything. Tarik, I appreciate you coming on. It's been fun. We've covered a lot of topics and got into some territory that I think will be challenging for our listeners, but I think it's interesting to talk about some of these things, especially because when you're talking about free will and how that plays into salvation in particular, those are questions that are kind of bantied back and forth among Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saint Christians a lot. So we appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective, and wish you the best of luck with your future academic career. Do you intend to teach after you attain your PhD?
That is the hope. Let's hope it becomes the reality. But yes, that's the idea. Okay.
Good deal. Look forward to seeing also what you write. I know you have a blog. Is there anything you want to promote?
Well, my blog is called Footnotes to Hume. That's alluding to David Hume, who's my favorite philosopher. And so I can send you the link to that blog, and you can plug it in if you'd like to. But besides that, I'm on Facebook. If any of your listeners want to reach out to me by email, you can have we'll put the email in there too. So, yeah.
All right. Yep.
I'm always free to talk.
All right. Thanks again. Best wishes and God bless to you and your family.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tarik. Good luck.
Later.
We thank you for tuning into this episode of the Outer Brightness Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please visit the Outer Brightness Podcast page on Facebook. Feel free to send us a message there with comments or questions by clicking Send a Message at the top of the page, and we would appreciate it if you give the page a like. We also have an Outer Brightness group on Facebook where you can join and interact with us and others as we discuss the podcast, past episodes, and suggestions for future episodes, etc. You can also send us an email at outerbrightness@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you soon.
You can subscribe to the Outer Brightness Podcast on Apple Podcasts, CastBox, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Podbean, Spotify, and Stitcher. Also, you can check out our new YouTube channel, and if you like it, be sure to lay hands on that subscribe button and confirm it. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating and review wherever you listen and help spread the word.
You can also connect with Michael, the ex-Mormon apologist, at FromWaterToWine.org, where he blogs, and sometimes Paul and Matthew do as well.
Music for the Outer Brightness Podcast is graciously provided by the talented Brianna Flournoy and by Adams Road. Learn more about Adams Road by visiting their ministry page at adamsroadministry.com. Stay bright, fireflies.
Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to